Can a computer make you cry? Right now, no one knows. This is partly because many would consider the very idea frivolous, but it's also because whoever successfully answers this question must first have answered several others. Why do we cry? Why do we laugh or love or smile? What are the touchstones of our emotions? Until now, the people who asked such questions tended not to be the same people who ran software companies. Instead, they were writers, filmmakers, painters, musicians. They were, in the traditional sense, artists. We're about to change that tradition. The name of our company is Electronic Arts. In 1982, Trip Hawkins, an employee of Apple, had an idea to burst into the burgeoning video game market. But in an area already so saturated, how do you stand out? Well, he and his co-founders had an idea to employ people who thought differently, who wanted to push the medium forward. He wanted to find people who believed that electronics could be art. The freshly formed Electronic Arts was nothing like its peers. They made a statement, with packaging meant to evoke album artwork, press releases that called their developers artists. The name itself was inspired by United Artists, the production studio founded by the likes of Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford in response to the emerging Hollywood studio system. Much like the United Artists, EA would give control back to the creators to make things that were radical, that pushed the medium forward. And in 1983, they hit the world hard.
And it took me 9.5 years to think of the big idea. And the big idea is the software artist.
Archon the Light in the Dark is deceptive. At first glance, it looks like chess, until you try to take a piece. Ooh. In chess, the depth of strategy comes from the fact that each piece has a totally different way of moving around the board, and thus different ways of capturing other pieces. In Archon, this element has been simplified to flesh the game out in ways that only a video game can. Icons, as they're called, have a limited number of tiles to move in, but can do so in any configuration. Some are also allowed to hop over others if they fly. Things start to get complex when two opposite icons meet. Because the movement is so much freer, simply landing on an enemy isn't good enough to take them. You need to defeat them in a dynamic arena. There are three types of attackers: melee, ranged, and the unmatched power of the sun. Each side only has one kind of melee and area unit each, but the ranged units are full of variety, with projectiles that vary in speed, damage, and size. Attacks have a cooldown period to prevent linear, spammy offense, and there's a little tone that plays for each player to let them know when they can attack again. Oh, and each icon has a different amount of health. The combat area changes constantly. Obstacles appear and disappear, sometimes allowing projectiles to pass through. It isn't so often that it gets obnoxious, but it switches up the situation to keep both players on their toes. You can get into some tense fights. This switching, shifting element is actually a small part of the game's overall theme, the light and the dark. See, each square on the board is either light or dark. When a light unit is on a light tile, they have a higher health pool. Vice versa for dark units. This means that you have to maneuver in such a way that your pieces only fight on tiles that are advantageous to yourself. How do you break the stalemate, then? Well, with these 5 spaces on the board, called power points, which will heal your units more than usual every turn. While you can win by destroying your opponent's whole army, you can also win by controlling all 5 power points. There's also the so-called luminosity circle, which goes back and forth from light to dark in 6 stages, advancing every turn. Each side has a mage, the wizard for white and sorceress for dark. These are the only units that can cast spells. There's a number of them, and they can only be used one time each, ranging from healing or reviving a friendly unit, to locking one in place for a few turns, or even shifting the flow of time, which reverses the cycle of the luminosity circle. Archon has aged incredibly well, and I had a lot of fun with it. The only knock from a modern perspective is that the combat controls are a little clunky. Devs at this time were still trying to do the 8-way control with a keyboard thing that you saw with games like Randam, also 83 actually. It's not the worst thing ever once you find a good control scheme, because did I mention that the game lets you change your keybinds? My god! This might sound weird, but you genuinely have no idea how rare it was to see this in a title from this era. You were lucky to remap your controls in games 10 years after this. Thanks, Paul Reiche III. Wait, is that really his name? Paul Reiche III? Funny thing, when I was in Berlin, I one time caught myself humming to the tune while on the street and realized I have to censor myself. I'm not a Nazi, at least I think so. Who knows what happens if I get some huge changes in my cozy life. Never know how people can be changed and broken. But the tune is really catchy. For some reason, I like all kinds of controversial songs, like ISIS Anthem, etc. Maybe because it's like kind of like forbidden fruit. What the fuck? Besides Archon, Paul is best known for many things, in fact. He released a sequel, Archon 2, the next year, and later went on to co-create the very influential Star Control series. In 1989, he and his creative partner, Fred Ford, founded Toys for Bob, and the rest is history. Well, I'll go into a little detail. One game of his that caught my eye was 1994's The Horde for 3DO, an FMV tower defense action game starring Kirk Cameron. I streamed it like 2 years ago and I thought it was gonna suck, but it's actually kinda cool. In '98, they released The Unholy War for PS1, a game that also attempted a blend of action combat and strategic maneuvering. It seems to be a theme. That's all well and good, but it turns out that they were big fans of the SD Gundam games, and wanted to get the license so they could reuse Unholy War's engine.
Our president of our company at the time said, "Hey, I know people at Bondi, I can make that happen." And we're like, "Oh, wow, this is awesome." And the message that we got back was, Bondi loves Unholy War. They think it's a great idea, but you know what? They have an even bigger license, like huge. And we're like, well, what could it be? So the contract was signed before we knew what we were making. And all we knew is the fax was going to start churning out the images. And so sure enough, the fax starts going and we can see the Japanese kanji header and like, here it comes. And it's like this girl from the 60s with a magical makeup kit. And we're like, what?
Bandai couldn't give them Gundam, but they could give them 30 years of Magical Girl anime. This resulted in Magical Daisaksen, Little Witching Mischiefs, the ultimate, except Sailor Moon, Magical Girl crossover strategy action video game. God bless. Hard Hat Mac is a lot like Archon in that it looks like another game at first, but is actually something quite different. In this case, it's clearly aping Donkey Kong, and while it does have similar elements like climbing ladders up a construction site and fall damage, the diversions start pretty immediately. For one, the goal is not actually to get to the top. It's to first pick up the pieces of girder, fill up the holes, then grab the jackhammer and walk over those spots to fix them up. There's a spring that launches you one level higher than you jumped, and a bell you can ring to call an elevator. All the while you're being hounded by a vandal and having bolts thrown at you by an OSHA inspector. Yeah, apparently back in '83, this upset California Senator Dan McCorquodale so much that he wrote a letter to a local store to have it pulled from the shelves. And it was! The back of the box referred to OSHA as, quote, living proof of the banality of evil. So maybe he had a point. The differences don't stop there, however, as this game has 3 different levels with completely different layouts, obstacles, and objectives. In the second, you need to collect toolboxes and then climb to the top. In the third, you need to pick up more girders and drop them into one of 2 rivet machines. This is someone else's footage because I never got to level 3. This game is hard, at least for my zoomer brain. I'm not sure if it was made difficult because there's only 3 levels, seeing as it just loops once you beat all 3. To beat even the first one, I had to really pay attention to the Vandal and the OSHA rep, whose patterns constantly adjust based on where you are. And you've only got 3 lives with no way to gain more. The game wants you to develop patience. Simply running forward to the next piece of girder will get you sniped, poor positioning can get you cornered by the Vandal, and a jump too late or too early can result in a death by falling. Hard Hat Mac didn't really excite me in the same way that Archon did, where that game felt like it was doing something really different from the arcade hits of the time. Mac is trying to one-up them at their own game by stepping up the complexity. Personally, it's not my favorite style, but if you're into that era of arcade, you can probably get a lot out of it. Hey, speaking of being derivative, the Standing Stones. It's an extremely run-of-the-mill first-person dungeon crawler. Played like 10 of these when I made my video on the Play-Doh. You walk around a dungeon, collect gold, and fight enemies by pressing one button and seeing what happens. The controls are cramped. There's some funny enemy names. There's legit just like thousands of these kinds of games out there. The creators, Peter Schmuckel and Dan Summers, also have no other credits to their name. Moving on. Unlike the last entry, Murder on the Zinderneuf is a baller game. This is a murder mystery set in 1936 on a luxury airship floating 5,000 feet above the Atlantic. When the titular Zinderneuf left London, there were 16 passengers aboard. Now, there's 15. With 12 hours on the clock before it arrives in New York, you assume the role of one of 8 detectives. You need to piece together the clues, interrogate suspects, and uncover who the murderer is before they get away for good. This game feels so ahead of its time in terms of complexity and innovation. Not only is it a narrative game, the narrative is dynamic. It changes each round. Every time you play, any of the 16 passengers could be the victim, and any of the 15 remaining, the killer. Everyone has a different motive, and the way you deduce who might have done it is going to change each playthrough. You are literally playing a randomized detective story, where every run has its own storyline depending on how you, the player, solve the case. Take a run I had, for instance. The victim was Felicity Sucrose, a young, high-class girl and daughter to the gossip magazine mogul Margaret Vandergilt, also on the ship. At first, I looked for Margaret, but when she was missing from her room, I checked Felicity's quarters. Finding clues is as simple as walking around, and within seconds, I uncover a diamond-encrusted wedding ring. Very suspicious. Why would Felicity, a single girl, have one of those? Back in Margaret's room, I find the butt of an English cigarette. The instruction manual has details on every passenger, from basic facts about their appearance to their relationships with others on board and habits. It's a great game to take notes for. While Margaret smokes, the only one the manual points out as smoking English cigarettes is the mercenary Rod London. Margaret is single right now, so they might have a connection. There's also the fact that no one seems to trust Rod London, and the preacher, Jeremiah Fulmuth, warns me that Felicity was not the untouched maiden she seemed. The 8 playable detectives, in addition to being tongue-in-cheek references to classic screen and novel sleuths, have many different strengths and weaknesses. This time I was playing as Humboldt House, the Sherlock Holmes analog, who has the easiest time finding clues, but isn't the best at talking to people. When you question a suspect, you get a selection of 5 different approaches, which vary depending on the detective. House's options lean more towards coldness, while another's might be more forceful, or even seductive. From there, you can ask them about any of the other passengers, and their responses can clue you in on possible connections and motives. Rod has good things to say about Margaret, despite how other people look down on her, but says that Felicity was not his type. In his room, I find a hair ribbon. Now, why would he have one of those? Unfortunately, I ran into a wall here. I wanted to know more about Rod London's possible involvement with Felicity, but everything came up empty. Eventually, I thought I had another lead in the form of a clue about Margaret, that she's a patron of the arts. But which arts? Well, there is a character on board, Vincent, who is an artist under her patronage, but there's a detail in the manual about the burlesque queen Sally Rose, who's made at least one art film. Maybe this was a subtle hint? Again, I don't find anything substantial, but I'm almost certain it was indeed London on the track, so when the game asks if I'll give one final guess, I take a chance and... Jeremiah? Yeah, it was the preacher. He was the one who proposed to Felicity, and when he felt guilty about his temptation, killed her out of religious zeal. That line about her not being a pure maiden was the thread I should have followed. Instead, I got hung up on a red herring and let the murderer get away. This is just one playthrough, too. Every real second is an in-game minute, meaning that each round is only 12 minutes total, although looking at your clues pauses the timer. That's a perfect amount of time. I felt like I had enough to figure things out, but there's still an element of pressure, especially when it gets down to the wire. I even appreciate these little details, like the sound of the engines getting quieter when you go into a room. Murder on the Zinderneuf has aged fantastically. It could be released today and it would still feel fresh. The only changes I would make to modernize it are really just the product of hardware moving forward, namely storage space. Like, I'd include the information from the manual in-game with some sort of quick reference sheet, maybe a way to write down notes. That's it. This game is great, and if I was around in '83, it would be really exciting. Software worthy of the minds that use it. We are a new association of electronic artists united by a common goal to fulfill the enormous potential of the personal computer. In the short term, that means transcending its present use as a facilitator of unimaginative tasks and a medium for blasting aliens. In the long term, however, we can expect a great deal more. These are wondrous machines we have created, and in them can be seen a bit of their makers. It is as if we had invested them with the image of our minds, and through them we are learning more and more about ourselves. We learn, for instance, that we are more entertained by the involvement of our imaginations than by passive viewing and listening. We learn that we are better taught by experience than by memorization, and we learn that the traditional distinctions, the ones that are made between art and entertainment and education, don't always apply. Murder on the Zinderneuf was put together by the same team that made Archon, which might explain some of its quality. Freeman and Westphal, for their part, would split off from Reiche in the following years and form Epix. The other programmer, Robert Leland, would follow Reiche to Toys for Bob and end up programming a bunch of stuff for them. What sticks out to me about Zinderneuf is how different it is. When the zeitgeist was in these arcadey-style, gameplay-heavy kind of adventure romps, it's a much more narrative-focused game. And while other games were also attempting to have more of an emphasis on story, they're a lot more primitive. It reminds me of what Chris Crawford described as the fourth phase of a medium's evolution, where works are created that could only be, say, a video game. Crawford was pushing to make games that blurred the line between narrative and story and had the player engage with these things in a way that you rarely see even today. Check out my video on him if you're curious. One-on-one, Dr. J vs. Larry Bird, is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a one-on-one basketball game, pitting two legends of the NBA against each other. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know how to judge sports games. Sports have never been my forte, and I couldn't tell you what distinguishes a good one from a bad one, besides, like, not being busted. You can choose from either player, although as far as I'm aware they play identically, and dribble, dunk, steal, and shoot, with either a points goal or a time limit. I'm gonna go out on a limb and claim that while it's pretty simple, it's not bad, although I am bad at it. I will say, it was an interesting choice to set this game on a basketball court at the gates of hell. The main programmer of this was Eric Hammond, who spent the years following it programming some more sports titles until the 90s, where he started doing a lot of sound design and music for games like Cliffhanger. Oh, it was the Sega versions, never mind. Weird coincidence, though. He also arranged music for Loom, and somehow contributed to Burning Rangers, House of the Dead, Shining Force 3, and Panzer Dragoon Saga, of all games. I guess he had some connection to Sega? I hate to have two quiet entries in a row, but next up is Axis Assassin. Now, from the title, I expected maybe a World War II espionage adventure, but it's just Tempest, though somehow more repetitive? I legit have nothing to say about this one. It uses a wireframe art style. You're a little ship. You hop between columns and shoot at enemies. Repeat until you run out of lives. It's Tempest. The developer, John Field, also didn't make much more than this. Kind of a dud in my book. This one, on the other hand, is much more interesting. Worms is described as a software toy, but I would just describe it as a kind of simulator or experimental game. It's like an interactive version of Conway's Game of Life, which is a simulation of cells reproducing and dying with specific rules to govern how that happens. Worms, also known as IQ in the UK, takes place on a board with up to 4 so-called worms, which are different colored lines. The player's worm moves to the right by default on the first turn, and then you must tell it where to go next. But you aren't just giving a one-off order, you're actually programming a behavior into your worm. Every time a worm encounters a situation it hasn't seen before, it asks the player what it should do next. And the next time it's in the same situation, it'll do what you told it the first time. You're basically teaching a simple AI. For instance, to go back to the first turn, the worm has never seen a situation where there's one line to its left and none around it. So you tell it to move down to the right. Now it's in another new state. One line to the top right and none around it. You tell it to move to the right, and now, because it's already seen this exact scenario up here, it goes down and to the right, like you told it, and then right, and on, and you have a zigzag pattern. There is a game here. When a player's worm has marked enough lines around a point, it claims that area and adds to the player's score. Worms die when they crash head-on, and the game ends when every worm is dead. Then the winner is decided by points. While there's obviously some strategy to this, I found a lot more enjoyment out of just building up a lot of commands and letting the simulation run. Every move the worms make emits a tone, and once things get going, they can make some pretty pleasant, aleatoric music. Before the game starts, you can change what type each worm is. Either a new player-controlled one, the same worm from the previous run, a random CPU, an optimized CPU, or nothing at all. I really like Worms. It's simple, charming, and intriguing. Its elements of winning and losing are pretty loose, and it's more about the neat stuff that happens along the way. The creator, David S. Maynard, is actually a super important person in the history of computing. Not only was he among the earliest founders of EA, he helped develop Starflight, a direct inspiration to Paul Reich's Star Control, as well as Skate or Die, Chuck Yeager's Advanced Flight Simulator, and Jordan vs. Bird 1-on-1. He later produced a game by Ozark Studios, who you'll see later, called Modem Wars, one of, if not the first games played over the internet. He was a co-founder of 3DO, which was one of Trip Hawkins' ventures, and while that didn't work out, you can thank him for being a contributor to the NLS, aka Online System. That was a mainframe computer system from the 60s that pioneered, like, a billion things we take for granted today. hypertext, the computer mouse, email, graphical interfaces, live video. There's probably more that I'm missing. He was also responsible for helping to create the first "what you see is what you get" word processor for Japanese, which takes this and lets the user edit it like this, basically making computers accessible to a wide Japanese audience. David S. Maynard is a fascinating person with a storied career, and Worms is just a slice of that. In fact, he maintains a website, which he updates infrequently, and has created a version of Worms playable in browser called Darworms. It's great, check it out. You can even change the instrument and key for each worm. Debug is a strange little game. EA clearly wanted to round out their first year of releases and hit a lot of markets. Throw a sports game in, throw in some arcadey games. Debug was their shot at educational gaming. After the absolutely sublime intro is done playing, you're presented with... is this like a computer's motherboard? Oh, we're playing... What is this? Am I trying to get butterflies? And we're back. There's a handyman, and he walks into the computer and goes to the store, and whoa! Now the fan is spinning. I think my cursor is on the 1. Some characters run by. I think I picked the girl? She's running off screen, and now we're back to the butterflies. What is going on? Okay, so despite being a game for children, I had to read the manual pretty closely to even get a semblance of how this game works. Its aim is to teach kids about how a computer works, and it does this in a 2-part structure. The first phase of the game is what they call Gacha. Player 1 gets points when butterflies are selected. Player 2 gets points when sailboats are selected. Each player goes back and forth lighting up symbols, and there's a strategy element that you can only choose the immediate neighbors of the last square to be lit up. The boards are randomized, and there's a decent game here in a simple kind of Connect 4 way, where you can force the other player into bad situations. But it's not terribly deep. This all goes swimmingly until some kind of malfunction occurs in the computer that I guess you're playing this on in universe? Then one player responds to this by walking over to the affected area. You can use the shop to replace a part of the component, and the game tells you what kind of issue there is with color-coded errors. There's definitely some care to make it a competent game. The score you accrue in Gacha becomes both your time limit and resource for buying parts, so both players are encouraged to do well in this part of the game. Can't help but wonder if this is actually like a brutal system where doing poorly at Gacha means that you have less time and resources to do the fixing part of the game. At the same time, it's pretty hard to mess up, so maybe I'm overthinking it. The manual does describe the game's goals as being to teach deductive reasoning through trial and error problem diagnosis. I guess if they stuck with it and really tried to understand how it works, a kid could probably walk away having learned something. There's a lot going on in Debug, but it's a pretty interesting example of an educational game that tried to be more than just a series of flashcards dressed up as a game, which is how a lot of these end up. It is legitimately trying to use the unique properties of the medium to teach kids something, and I can at least respect it for that. Something that might be lost on generations today is how gigantic pinball used to be. Yeah, I've always thought of it as this sort of quaint game. I never really understood the appeal myself, but it dominated 20th century American culture. In the 40s, it was outright banned in several cities like New York, a decision that was lifted in 1976, just a few years before EA's founding. Inspired by a pinball craze at Apple, where he worked, Bill Budge created Raster Blaster, the most sophisticated pinball video game at the time. No doubt encouraged by its warm reception, his next project would take the tools used to develop that game and turn it into a piece of standalone software. Thus, Pinball Construction Set was born. Nowadays, we would call this a sandbox simulator game, but at the time, Budge chose the term construction set because there really wasn't anything like it. Software that lets you make your own things, make your own fun, was so unexplored that this became an instant hit and one of the company's biggest games. And I have to say, as someone who doesn't really care for pinball, this is still a cool game to play around with. It's quite fleshed out. You're able to modify pretty much anything to some extent. Change the shape of the board, add or remove corners. All this is really smooth, by the way. Customize the board colors, add or remove a pretty wide assortment of obstacles and elements. You can even mess with the physics of the ball. The only limitations are more products of the hardware, like only having the bounds of the play area to work with and the limited color palette. Budge himself went on to join Trip Hawkins at the 3DO company and put in a ton of work programming their first-party titles. Sadly, the system wouldn't catch on, and he bounced around Sony and Google for about 20 years before retiring in 2022. Due to its nature, I don't have a ton to say about Pinball Construction Set, but I have to acknowledge that it's the progenitor of every simulator and sandbox title you know today. Minecraft, SimCity, Tycoon, all of them can be traced back to the spark of this little game. Aw, baby, I saved the best for last. I already said pretty much everything I wanted to about M.U.L.E in my video on it from like 2 years ago, but it bears repeating. Much like Pinball Construction Set, M.U.L.E is the blueprint for practically every Western multiplayer game released since 1983. It's a straightforward, intuitive, and elegant competition about basic economics and resource management. The premise sees 4 players dropped onto the alien world of Errata, or Atari backwards. While they're tasked with growing a thriving economy, they do this by competing for resources via trade. Each round, every player gets to claim a plot of land, which they can develop using the titular M.U.L.E, multi-use labor elements. These little AT-AT looking things are robots that you can outfit to produce either food, energy, or the fictional metal smith ore. Once everyone's turn is done, their land produces resources based on a few factors, namely location. Plains produce more energy, the river produces more food, and the mountains more smith ore. There's also a number of random events that can occur, such as pests eating all the food, and sunstorms that raise energy production. There's also random cash bonuses that can come to any player, although there's built-in rubber banding to prevent the first and last place players from getting too far apart. Once the resources have been harvested, the second phase of the round begins, the auction. Here, everyone gets a report on how much was gained, lost, and whether they're in a shortage of something. This is where the real meat of the strategy comes in, the buying and selling. It's really intuitive. You literally walk the line up and down to represent how much you're willing to bargain. When they meet, resources actually exchange hands. Much like real capitalism, the game here lies in market manipulation to screw the others out of success and hoard materials for yourself. M.U.L.E has real economic systems like supply and demand. Food increases your turn time, energy powers your plots, and while smith ore isn't a necessary resource, it's what mules are made of. Thus, if you get a monopoly on smith ore and hoard it, you can actually drive up the price of mules in the corral for everyone else. Of course, if you only focus on smith ore, eventually you'll face diminishing returns and be forced to sell in order to afford expanding into the other resources. Or you could just have everything stolen by pirates and be left with no way to make your money back. One of the developers even describes this devious strategy in the manual where he'd purposely hoard smith ore, doing things like stepping in at the auction at the last minute when the other players are trying to sell to the store, and even purposely letting mules out of the corral, skyrocketing the cost of smith ore. The game really lets you get crafty with its various systems. There's even more that I haven't mentioned, namely the features you get on higher game modes like Tournament, including a 4th ultra-rare resource called Crystite, the ability to sell your land, and even make secret backroom deals with other players. At the heart of M.U.L.E is an incredibly deep but very accessible party game. Every time I play it, even by myself, I find that I get invested in what's happening, cursing at the CPU and planning out my next series of moves. It's this fun game with a quirky attitude that you can see in the alien races, the tongue-in-cheek jokes, the catchy title theme. The people who made this game loved it. It's bleeding through the screen. This is easily my favorite game of the bunch. I can't overstate how well it's held up, or how influential it's been on the entire history of multiplayer games. This was more than a high score contest. While there were multiplayer titles focused on strategy, those were on early mainframe systems. This was one of the first to do so in a way that was approachable and, more importantly, available to a mass market. Despite it being a competition filled with underhanded tactics, M.U.L.E was a game that aimed not to pit people against each other, but bring them together. And it does. M.U.L.E was developed by Ozark Software, a team of 4 consisting of Jim Rushing, Alan Watson, Bill Bunton, and his sibling, Danielle Bunton Berry. Danielle Bunton was one of the chief creative forces behind the game, as she herself was a pioneer in multiplayer gaming with her earlier titles Wheeler Dealers and Cytron Masters. She would continue this specialty in the following years with the 7 Cities of Gold, Heart of Africa, and Modem Wars, among others. That last one, to remind you, was an online multiplayer title in 1988. There's a famous quote from her that explains a bit of her obsession with multiplayer gaming. In a keynote presentation, she once said, quote, "No one on their deathbed ever said, 'Gee, I wish I had spent more time alone with my computer.'" But when asked in the Halcyon Days interview collection why she got into making video games in the first place, she gives an answer that cuts a little closer to the bone. Quote, "After years of therapy, I think I know the answer to this. When I was a kid, the only times my family spent together that weren't totally dysfunctional were when we were playing games." In 1992, she would undergo a sexual reassignment surgery and began to live as an out woman. This decision was not without its consequences. Her family grew alienated from her, and despite her incredible body of work, her connections in the industry dried up. In a retrospective article on her life, published by CBC in 2018, the creator of Loom, Brian Moriarty, described this process from his viewpoint. Quote, "It was sad. It changed her status. I was approached by a couple guys who wanted to found a multiplayer game company on the internet, and they came to me and said, 'Would you like to do this thing?' And I said, 'Why aren't you talking to Danny Bunton? I mean, Danny Bunton is the world's foremost authority on multiplayer games.' And they just looked at me, and I knew why." Her personal life after her transition put a hold on most of her game development aspirations, but she would return in '97 for Warsport, yet another multiplayer title. According to her, she had begun work on a sequel to M.U.L.E around this time. Unfortunately, in 1998, she discovered that she had terminal lung cancer from her smoking habit. She died the same year. I have a lot of respect for Danielle Berry. I think she deserved a lot better than she got. She made these incredible works of art for the noblest purpose, so that other people might find a little bit of the same peace games had given her. I want to send off this section with the same sentiment as my old video. If you can find the time to set up an Atari 8-bit emulator and wrangle some friends together, boot up M.U.L.E. Buy some land. Sell some Smith ore. Towards a language of dreams. In short, we are finding that the computer can be more than just a processor of data. It is a communications medium, an interactive tool that can bring people's thoughts and feelings closer together, perhaps closer than ever before. And while 50 years from now, its creation may seem no more important than the advent of motion pictures or television, there is a chance it will mean something more. Something along the lines of a universal language of ideas and emotions. Something like a smile. The first publications of Electronic Arts are now available. We suspect you'll be hearing a lot about them. Some of them are games like you've never seen before. They get more out of your computer than other games ever have. Others are harder to categorize, and we like that. Now, while I am on location at EA headquarters today, I don't want to talk about that. Everything that can be said about them today already has been, and every way that you could compare the EA of today to the games that we've been talking about, you've probably already been thinking. Instead, I want to focus more on these incredible games that we've been talking about. I've been interspersing this video with excerpts from an essay that was written in 1983 that declared their mission statement. And it was a statement that they really believed in. And I know that nowadays that statement has long since been sacrificed for greed and corporate profits, but that doesn't mean that just because it's gone, it's not worth believing in. I hope that above all, instead of cynicism, you can take from this video that there is room for creative, passionate people who care about the artwork that they make in this world. I hope that you gain a little bit of appreciation for all these pieces of gaming history that are so often overlooked. And above all, I hope that you can at least believe somewhat in that vision. Watch us. We're providing a special environment for talented, independent software artists. It's a supportive environment in which big ideas are given room to grow, and some of America's most respected software artists are beginning to take notice. We think our current work reflects this very special commitment, and though we are few in number today, and apart from the mainstream of the mass software marketplace, we are confident that both time and vision are on our side. Join us. We see farther.
Here comes a daredevil! Game over!